Somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, under a hill that looked like 100 other hills, a team of archaeologists found something they weren't looking for. They weren't hunting for a lost biblical city. They were doing the unglamorous, paperwork, heavy work that most archaeology actually is, a rescue excavation, ordered because a construction project was about to bulldoze straight through a mound nobody had bothered to dig properly in decades. And then the topsoil came off, and the story changed. Before we get into what they found, it's worth sitting with a strange tension that sits at the heart of this entire field. Biblical archaeology has spent more than a century caught between two audiences who trust it for completely opposite reasons and doubt it for completely opposite reasons too. On one side, there are readers who want every dig to be a confirmation machine. Proof that the text is exactly, literally, historically true, right down to the last detail. On the other side, there are scholars trained to be suspicious of anyone who starts digging with the Bible open in one hand and a trowel in the other, because motivated reasoning has a way of finding what it went looking for. The site we're going to walk through today is interesting precisely because it didn't start as either of those things. It started as bureaucracy. And that, oddly enough, is part of why serious researchers are taking it seriously. Most people imagine archaeological digs as expeditions. A team decides a place is important, secures funding, and spends years meticulously excavating it because they believe something significant is buried there. That does happen. But a huge amount of the archaeological work done anywhere in the world, and especially in regions dense with ancient settlement like the Levant, is what's called rescue or salvage archaeology. Here's how it typically works. A region wants to build something, a road, a pipeline, a housing development, an irrigation channel. Before construction can legally begin, local antiquities law usually requires a survey of the land to check whether anything of archaeological value sits underneath it. If the survey turns up something interesting, a team gets a limited window, sometimes a single field season, sometimes a few years if the finds are significant enough to justify delaying construction, to excavate, document, and remove whatever is worth preserving before the bulldozers move in. This is not the romantic version of archaeology. It's driven by deadlines, not curiosity. Teams don't get to choose their site because it looks promising. They get handed a site because someone else needs to build something on top of it, and the law says the past gets first look, which is exactly what happened here. The mound in question, what archaeologists call a tell, an artificial hill built up over centuries or millennia from the compacted debris of settlement after settlement, each built on the ruins of the one before, had been noted in regional surveys for decades. It was on the list, it was cataloged, but it had never been prioritized because the pottery scattered across its surface suggested something modest. A small village, not a major settlement. Surface scatter, the broken pottery fragments that erosion and plowing bring up to the surface over centuries, is one of the cheapest, fastest ways archaeologists make a preliminary judgment about a site before deciding whether it's worth the enormous cost of full excavation. And the preliminary judgment here was probably not much. That judgment turned out to be badly wrong. Before going further, it's worth explaining exactly what these mounds are, because the concept does a lot of work in understanding why this discovery is significant. Imagine a piece of land that's a good place to live, near water, on defensible high ground, along a trade route. People settle there. They build with mud brick, which is cheap, effective, and completely biodegradable. Eventually, that settlement is destroyed, abandoned, or simply falls into disrepair, and the mud brick structures collapse into rubble and dust. Instead of clearing the rubble away, the next group of people to settle the same spot, because it's still a good place to live, just builds on top of it. Level the rubble a bit, lay a new foundation, build again. Repeat this process for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, and you get a mound, a tell, that is essentially a layer cake of human occupation, each layer a different century, each layer telling a different chapter of the same location story. The Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant are covered in these mounds. Some estimates put the number of unexcavated tells in the region in the thousands. Archaeologists will never get to most of them. There isn't enough money, time, or trained personnel in the world to properly excavate even a fraction of the sites that are sitting there, silently waiting. This is part of why rescue archaeology matters so much and why so many significant discoveries, including apparently this one, happen not because someone set out looking for them, but because a construction deadline forced someone to look at all. Once the excavation team started peeling back the layers at this particular site, the first sign that something was off with the earlier assessment came from the fortifications. Beneath the topsoil, they found the remains of a substantial defensive wall, built the way many fortification walls from this general period and region were built, with large, roughly shaped stone blocks forming a base, and mud brick construction rising above it. This is a well-documented building technique. Archaeologists have found it at other fortified sites from the same broad era. What was unusual here wasn't the technique, it was the scale and the state of preservation. Walls like this are notoriously hard to find intact. Mud brick doesn't survive well. Stone foundations get robbed out by later builders looking for pre-cut material. Centuries of plowing and erosion chew away at anything close to the surface. Finding a wall system this well preserved is already a stroke of luck, but what really caught the team's attention was what the wall line implied about the size of the settlement it once enclosed. The original surface survey, remember, had suggested a small village. The excavated wall line suggested something else entirely, an urban center enclosing several hectares of space. That's not agricultural village-sized. That's not a seasonal herding camp or a small fortified farmstead. By the standards of settlements from this period and region, several hectares behind a proper defensive wall is a genuine city, a place with enough population, enough social organization, and enough resources to justify building serious fortifications in the first place. That's the moment the unglamorous rescue dig stopped being routine. If the wall was the first surprise, the next layer down was the one that really stopped everyone in their tracks. Beneath and alongside the fortification, excavators found what archaeologists call a destruction layer. And if you've never encountered this term before, it's worth understanding exactly what it looks like on the ground, because it's genuinely one of the more haunting things you can find in an excavation. A destruction layer isn't just old debris, it's a frozen moment. Ash from fires that burned hot enough to collapse roofs, charred wooden beams that once held up a ceiling, now lying exactly where they fell, pottery. Vessels smashed and scattered across floors, sometimes still in the rough arrangement they'd have been in on the day the building came down, because nobody came back afterward to clean up, sort through the wreckage, or salvage what could be salvaged. This is different from what archaeologists find at sites that were simply abandoned gradually, where families packed up and left, buildings slowly fell into disrepair, and the wear pattern in the soil tells a story of decline rather than catastrophe. A destruction layer tells a story of violence, invasion, war, fire, collapse, all happening fast enough that people didn't have time, or weren't alive, to clean up afterward. Destruction layers of this kind aren't rare in the archaeology of this particular region and time period. The end of the Late Bronze Age and the start of the Iron Age is one of the most studied periods of upheaval in the ancient world, and archaeologists have excavated destruction layers at dozens of comparable sites scattered across the eastern Mediterranean. What made this particular layer stand out wasn't that it existed, it was what was found inside it. Ancient pottery is, in a very real sense, one of the most information-dense artifacts archaeologists ever find. The shape of a vessel, the way it was fired, the decorative style painted or incised onto its surface, the specific clay composition used to make it, all of these details can be traced, compared, and cross-referenced against enormous databases of known pottery styles from across the ancient world. At this site, the pottery assemblage recovered from the destruction layer told a genuinely confusing story. Instead of a single coherent set of styles pointing clearly to one cultural group, excavators found forms and decorative motifs showing clear affinities with several distinct regional traditions at once. A mixture unusual enough that it has already generated real scholarly disagreement about exactly who was living in this city when it burned. Was this a mixed population, blending traditions through trade, intermarriage, or shared frontier living? Was it a site that changed hands between different groups multiple times, leaving overlapping layers of cultural material that got jumbled together during excavation? Or does it point to something researchers haven't fully considered yet about how cultural boundaries actually worked in this region during this turbulent period? Nobody has a confident answer yet. And to the credit of the excavation team, none of the preliminary reports pretend otherwise. To figure out roughly when this city burned, the team turned to radiocarbon dating, the standard tool archaeologists use to date organic material by measuring the decay of a radioactive isotope of carbon that all living things absorb while alive and stop absorbing the moment they die. In this case, the organic material came from the destruction layer itself, carbonized grain, charred wood fragments from the collapsed roof structures. Burned material is actually ideal for radiocarbon dating in some ways because carbonization can help preserve organic material that would otherwise decay away entirely. And because a fire that destroys a building at a specific moment gives archaeologists a wonderfully precise death date for the material caught inside it, much more precise than trying to date material from a slowly abandoned site where things were left behind gradually over years or decades. The radiocarbon dates from this destruction layer clustered with the normal statistical spread that always accompanies radiocarbon results, around 1100 BCE. That places the fire that destroyed this city squarely within one of the most consequential periods of upheaval in ancient Mediterranean history, a period during which numerous major urban centers across the entire region were destroyed, abandoned, or dramatically shrunk within the span of just a few generations. Historians still don't fully agree on what caused this wave of collapse. Theories over the decades have pointed to invasion by mysterious seafaring raiders, often referred to in older scholarship as the Sea Peoples, to climate change and prolonged drought disrupting agricultural systems, to systemic economic collapse as long-distance trade. Networks that sustained elite palace economies broke down, to internal social revolt against rigid, hierarchical palace-based societies, and to some combination of all of the above compounding into a genuine systems collapse. It remains one of the most actively debated puzzles in ancient history, and this newly excavated city's destruction sits right in the middle of that broader mystery. Now, to the question that's actually driving the popular headlines, is this a city named in the Bible? The honest answer is maybe, and nobody serious is claiming certainty yet. It's worth understanding just how difficult it actually is to match an excavated site to a specific place named in an ancient text, because popular reporting almost never conveys how provisional this kind of identification really is. Ancient texts, biblical or otherwise, describe geography using place names, approximate travel distances, and topographical landmarks that were often already centuries old by the time anyone wrote them down. These descriptions passed through generations of oral transmission, later scribal copying and editing and translation, across multiple ancient languages before arriving in the form we read today. A place name recorded in an ancient text doesn't come with GPS coordinates. Archaeologists identifying a site with an ancient toponym typically rely on several converging lines of evidence. Geographic position relative to other already identified sites is one. Does the mound sit roughly where ancient sources say the city should be, relative to landmarks and neighboring settlements that are more securely identified? Chronological fit is another. Does the site's occupation and destruction history line up with the period during which the text places significant events at that location? And, when archaeologists get lucky, direct inscriptional evidence, an object recovered at the site that actually names the settlement or the polity it belonged to, provides by far the strongest evidence of all because it removes the guesswork almost entirely. At this site, the case for a biblical identification currently rests mostly on the first two lines of evidence. Its geographic position corresponds reasonably closely to where several passages in the Hebrew Bible place a specific named city, and the chronological fit between the site's violent destruction and the approximate period during which biblical narrative places significant events at that location is genuinely suggestive, but on their own, neither of these is close to sufficient for a confident identification. Geographic correspondence, based on ancient textual description, always carries interpretive wiggle room, given how imprecise ancient geographic references generally were. And chronological fit, based on radiocarbon dating, comes with its own margins of uncertainty that make tying a destruction layer to a specific narrated event genuinely difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt. What has genuinely excited the excavation team and made outside reviewers simultaneously cautious and intrigued is a small handful of inscribed pottery fragments recovered from inside the destruction layer. These fragments bear incised or painted marks that, in the assessment of the epigraphers examining them, appear to be alphabetic characters from a script that was in active use across the region during this period. This matters enormously because a legible inscription, even a fragmentary one, is exactly the kind of direct evidence that can turn a probably based on geography and dating identification into something far more solid. But there's a catch, and it's an important one. The fragments are small, the legible portions of text they preserve are correspondingly brief. We're talking about a handful of characters, not complete sentences, and reading fragmentary ancient inscriptions is always by necessity part reconstruction and part interpretation. Trained epigraphers are extraordinarily good at this kind of work, using comparative knowledge of the script, context clues from where the fragment was found, and parallels from better preserved inscriptions elsewhere. If the preliminary readings hold up under the kind of sustained, skeptical adversarial scrutiny that any significant inscriptional find in this field inevitably receives, and that scrutiny can take years, the fragments may include a partial place name or personal name that would provide dramatically stronger grounds for identifying the site than geography and radiocarbon dating alone could ever offer. That's the tantalizing possibility currently sitting on researchers' desks. It's also, right now, still just a possibility. Here's the part of this story that tends to get buried under the more eye-catching biblical identification headlines, even though it's arguably the more genuinely puzzling issue for professional archaeologists. The end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant is generally understood as a period of dramatic social and economic contraction. The large, centralized palace economies that had dominated the region for centuries collapsed or were badly weakened. Long-distance trade networks that had sustained elite material culture and specialized craft production broke down. Many previously substantial urban centers were abandoned outright, destroyed, or reduced to a fraction of their former size. The prevailing scholarly model for this period generally does not anticipate the emergence of large, newly fortified cities, appearing during exactly this window of collapse. Contraction, abandonment, and downsizing are the expected pattern. A well-planned, substantially fortified city of the scale suggested by the wall line at this site, dated to a period generally associated with settlement collapse rather than settlement growth, represents a genuine anomaly that the existing model doesn't comfortably explain. Researchers examining the preliminary findings have floated a few possible explanations, and none of them has come close to consensus yet. One possibility is that this site is a genuine outlier, a local population that, for reasons specific to its geography, its access to resources, or its political circumstances, managed to build or maintain a level of urban development that most of the surrounding region simply couldn't sustain during this turbulent stretch. This wouldn't be unprecedented. The late Bronze Age collapse wasn't uniform across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Certain areas appear to have weathered the disruption considerably better than others, for reasons researchers still don't fully understand. A second possibility is that the chronological picture is more tangled than the initial radiocarbon dates suggest. It's genuinely possible that what excavators are currently interpreting as a single destruction event actually represents the compressed, conflated remains of multiple successive occupation phases, a real risk at any complex multi-period tell, especially in the early stages of fieldwork before the full stratigraphic sequence has been carefully teased apart. If that turns out to be the case, the apparent anomaly might resolve into a more conventional story. A city that was actually built earlier, during a period of greater regional stability, and only destroyed later, during the wider collapse, rather than having been constructed during the collapse itself. A third possibility, raised more cautiously but generating the most active debate, is that this site's material culture and its position relative to other regional settlements might eventually require some revision to the broader chronological framework currently used to date sites across this entire transitional period. A framework built up over decades of comparative pottery analysis, radiocarbon, dating, and cross-referencing against the more securely anchored chronologies of neighboring civilizations, particularly Egypt, whose extensive historical records provide some of the firmest chronological pegs available for the ancient Near East as a whole. Frameworks like this do get revised periodically as new evidence accumulates. If you've followed biblical archaeology headlines over the years, you've probably noticed a pattern. A discovery gets announced with enormous fanfare, gets triumphantly linked to a specific biblical event or figure, dominates news cycles for a week or two, and then quietly gets walked back, qualified, or outright abandoned. Once more rigorous analysis or additional field seasons complicate the initial story. This has happened often enough that it's become something of an institutional scar tissue within the field. Sites confidently identified with specific biblical cities in the early 20th century have, in more than one instance, had those identifications quietly abandoned or heavily qualified decades later by researchers working with better dating techniques, more rigorous epigraphic method, and considerably more comparative data than the original excavators had access to. What's genuinely notable about the reporting on this current excavation is how restrained the excavation team's own published preliminary statements have been. They explicitly flag the provisional nature of the pottery-based dating. They openly acknowledge the genuine uncertainty surrounding the fragmentary inscriptional material. And they have declined, so far, to assert a definitive identification with any specific biblical toponym, pending further seasons of excavation and more extensive laboratory analysis of everything they've recovered. That restraint isn't just good manners. It's the discipline learning from its own history of embarrassment, and it's honestly one of the more reassuring signals available to anyone trying to judge how seriously to take a claim like this. Extraordinary claims announced with maximum confidence and minimum hedging are, historically, the ones that don't hold up. Extraordinary claims announced with this much visible caution tend to be the ones worth actually watching. So what would it take to move this discovery from intriguing, provisional, and actively debated to well-established? A few specific things stand out. First, further excavation across a wider horizontal exposure of the destruction layer would help clarify whether the impressive scale suggested by the wall line holds up consistently across the entire site, or whether the sections excavated so far, however well preserved, represent a particularly dramatic but geographically limited portion of what might turn out to be a more modest overall settlement once the full extent is mapped. Second, a broader radiocarbon sampling program, drawing charred material from multiple distinct contexts spread across the site rather than concentrated in one excavated area, would help establish whether the destruction date really is as tightly clustered and reliable as the initial samples suggest, or whether wider sampling reveals more chronological complexity lurking beneath the surface than the current picture implies. Third, continued careful conservation and analysis of the inscribed pottery fragments, ideally supplemented by the discovery of additional inscriptional material in future field seasons, would be necessary before any proposed reading of a place name or personal name could be considered well established rather than a genuinely suggestive but still provisional interpretation of frustratingly small, frustratingly incomplete evidence. None of this can happen overnight. Archaeological fieldwork is slow by nature, constrained by funding cycles, seasonal weather windows, the availability of trained specialists, and, in this particular case, by the looming infrastructure project that prompted the rescue excavation in the first place. The team has indicated further seasons are planned, contingent on continued funding and on antiquities, authorities granting continued access ahead of construction. Whether that access holds long enough to answer the biggest open questions remains itself an open question. Here's the thing worth sitting with as this story continues to develop. Even if the specific biblical identification question never reaches full scholarly confidence, and it's entirely possible it never will, given the inherent limits of the available evidence, the excavation itself is already contributing genuinely valuable data to a period of ancient history that remains poorly understood despite decades of accumulated research. The transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age across the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the most consequential periods of transformation in the ancient world. It's the period during which the political map of the region was substantially redrawn, long-established trade networks collapsed, and were eventually replaced by entirely new patterns of exchange, and the cultural and political groups that would go on to dominate the historical record of the following centuries first began taking the shape in which later written sources describe them. Understanding precisely how, why, and in what sequence this transformation actually unfolded across different parts of the region remains one of the genuinely open questions in ancient Near Eastern archaeology. Every carefully excavated, carefully dated site from this period, regardless of whether it can eventually be matched with confidence to a specific place named in any ancient text, adds meaningful data to that broader reconstruction effort. A well-documented case of a substantial fortified settlement persisting, or even emerging, during a period generally associated with regional collapse would itself represent a genuinely significant contribution to understanding just how uneven, regionally variable, and locally contingent this transformative period actually was. It could help correct what may currently be an overly uniform picture of collapse, a picture drawn disproportionately from the handful of better excavated sites that have so far dominated the scholarly narrative, simply because they were the ones that happened to get dug first. The popular framing of discoveries like this one as mysteries that archaeologists can't explain captures something real about the current state of the research, even if it overstates the drama involved. Archaeologists aren't being confounded by some inexplicable anomaly that threatens the entire framework of ancient Near Eastern history. They're doing exactly what careful archaeological science is supposed to do when it runs into a finding that doesn't fit smoothly into the existing model, taking this anomaly seriously, proposing multiple competing explanations, and committing to the additional fieldwork, dating, and analysis that will eventually let those competing explanations get tested against better evidence. Whether the eventual answer confirms an exceptional local success story surviving amid regional collapse, reveals more conventional chronology than the initial dates currently suggest, or contributes to a genuine refinement of the region's entire chronological framework, the process by which that answer gets reached will be the same patient, incremental, evidence-driven process that has always characterized archaeology at its best. It's considerably less dramatic than the headlines make it sound, but in its own way, it's more genuinely interesting, because what it will ultimately produce isn't a neatly resolved mystery wrapped up in a single triumphant announcement. It's a clearer, richer, more textured understanding of a genuinely pivotal moment in human history, built one careful season, one radiocarbon sample, and one fragment of ancient pottery at a time. And that, more than any single headline, is what makes this particular mound, a hill that looked like 1,000 other hills, until a construction deadline forced someone to finally dig, worth paying attention to.